This millionaire abandoned his 8-year-old daughter with cancer, but years later, when he was broke, he saw her on TV and recognized her. What happened to her after being abandoned will shock you, and their reunion will bring you to tears. Subscribe to the channel to support my work and comment what you miss the most in your life. The glass walls of Ethan Morgan's corner office offered a panoramic view of downtown Columbus, but he barely noticed the scenery anymore. His attention was fixed on the spreadsheets before him, each number representing another crack in the empire he'd built from nothing. The quarterly reports for his chain of premium supermarkets painted a grim picture, one that grew darker with each passing day. Ethan ran his fingers through his graying hair, the gold Rolex on his wrist catching the late afternoon sunlight. 20 years ago, he'd opened his first store with nothing but a loan and a dream. Now, at 45, he owned 37 locations across Ohio, each one a testament to his relentless drive for success. Or at least, that's what they used to be. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Morgan, your wife is here to see you," his assistant announced. "Send her in," he replied, not bothering to look up from his desk. The click of Victoria's heels against the marble floor announced her arrival, a sound that had once filled him with anticipation, but now only served to heighten his anxiety. "We need to talk," Victoria said, her voice carrying the same cold efficiency she used in board meetings. She stood before his desk, perfectly poised in her designer suit, not a platinum blonde hair out of place. Ethan finally looked up, noting the determination in her eyes. "I'm busy, Victoria. The quarterly numbers are worse than we thought, and I need to figure out how to—" "I'm leaving you," she interrupted, her words precise and measured. "I've already spoken with my lawyers." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Ethan's hands gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "What are you talking about?" "Don't pretend to be surprised, Ethan. We both know this has been coming for a long time." Victoria's red lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The papers will be delivered tomorrow. I'm taking my share of the assets, which, given the state of your business, might be all that's left." Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was James, his CFO. With trembling fingers, he answered, putting it on speaker. "What is it, James?" "Sir, we have a problem. The bank is calling in our loans, all of them. They're saying we've defaulted on our payment terms." James's voice cracked with panic. "They're giving us 48 hours to come up with the money." Victoria's smile widened ever so slightly. "Well, isn't that interesting timing?" She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Oh, and Ethan, I know about you and the expansion plans. Did you really think taking out second mortgages on all our properties without board approval would go unnoticed forever?" The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through Ethan's bones. He sat there, frozen, as his world crumbled around him. The empire he'd built, the wealth he'd accumulated, the reputation he'd cultivated, all of it was slipping through his fingers like sand. His phone buzzed again, a text from Madison's oncologist reminding him about tomorrow's treatment session. His 8-year-old daughter, his little princess, fighting a battle no child should have to face. The treatments were expensive, draining what little resources he had left. But Madison was all he had now, the only pure thing in his life of ruthless ambition and cold calculations. Ethan stood up, walking to the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city he'd once thought he owned. In the reflection of the glass, he caught sight of his own face, the lines of worry, the dark circles under his eyes, the defeat written in every feature. He barely recognized himself. His phone rang again, this time showing an unknown number. When he answered, the voice on the other end delivered the final blow. "Mr. Morgan, this is Detective Sanders from the Financial Crimes Unit. We're investigating several complaints about irregular business practices at your stores. We'll need you to come in for questioning." As the detective continued speaking, Ethan's gaze drifted to the family photo on his desk. Him, Victoria, and Madison at the beach last summer. Madison's smile was bright despite her illness, her eyes full of trust and love for her father, the same father who now stood on the precipice of losing everything. The sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving Ethan alone in the growing darkness of his office. In the shadows, a desperate plan began to form in his mind, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across Madison's pale face as she slept. The steady beep of monitors filled the sterile air while Ethan sat beside her bed, his designer suit wrinkled from spending another night in the uncomfortable hospital chair. His daughter's small hand felt fragile in his, her skin cool to the touch despite the warmth of the room. Madison stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Despite the exhaustion evident in her young face, she managed a weak smile. "Daddy, you stayed," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the latest round of treatments. "Of course I did, Princess." Ethan tried to keep his voice steady, pushing down the wave of guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. He hadn't told her about Victoria's departure 3 days ago, or about the mounting catastrophes that were consuming their lives. A nurse entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan. Dr. Reynolds would like to speak with you about Madison's next treatment cycle." Her professional smile didn't quite mask the concern in her eyes. Ethan squeezed Madison's hand gently. "I'll be right back, sweetheart. Try to get some more rest." In the hallway, Dr. Reynolds stood waiting, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more hesitant. "Mr. Morgan, we need to discuss Madison's treatment plan. The latest round hasn't been as effective as we'd hoped." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We'd like to try a more aggressive approach, but I must warn you, the costs will be significantly higher." Ethan's stomach churned. "How much higher?" The doctor named a figure that made Ethan's head spin. It was more than he could possibly afford now, with his assets frozen and creditors circling like vultures. I'll need some time to arrange the finances," he managed to say. Back in Madison's room, he found her attempting to eat the hospital breakfast, her small face scrunching up at the taste of bland oatmeal. "Daddy, when can we go home? I miss my own bed and my books and cooking with Rosa." The mention of their housekeeper sent another pang through Ethan's heart. He'd had to let Rosa go yesterday, along with the rest of the household staff. The mansion would be seized by the bank within weeks. "Soon, Princess, very soon." His phone vibrated in his pocket, another call from James. Stepping into the hallway, he answered. "What now?" "Sir, it's worse than we thought. The board. They've voted to remove you as CEO. They're saying it's temporary, pending the investigation, but—" James's voice cracked. "They've appointed Victoria as interim CEO. She was behind it all along, working with Richard Thompson." Richard Thompson, Ethan's longtime business partner and friend. Or so he'd thought. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Victoria's perfectly timed departure, the loan recalls, the board's sudden action. They'd planned this, probably for months. "She's been feeding information to the investigators, sir. Bank records, board minutes, everything. And there's more. She and Richard, they've been seen together, often. I'm sorry, but I thought you should know." Ethan ended the call, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone. Through the window of Madison's room, he could see her attempting to read a book, her movements slow and careful around the IV lines. She was so innocent, so undeserving of the storm that was about to break over their lives. That evening, after Madison had fallen asleep, Ethan sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cold cup of coffee. The TV mounted on the wall was playing the local news. His face appeared on screen, alongside headlines about the investigation into his business practices. The reporter was discussing the potential charges, the millions in questionable loans, the likelihood of criminal prosecution. His phone rang again. This time, it was his lawyer. They're moving faster than we anticipated, Ethan. The DA is pushing for immediate action. They'll be issuing an arrest warrant within days. And I have to be honest, with the evidence they have, we're looking at serious time. The words echoed in Ethan's head as he made his way back to Madison's room. Standing in the doorway, he watched his daughter sleep, her chest rising and falling rhythmically. The moonlight streaming through the window gave her an almost ethereal appearance, highlighting how fragile she truly was. A nurse approached with a stack of papers. "Mr. Morgan, we need to discuss the billing situation. Your insurance company is refusing to cover the next round of treatments without pre-approval, and given the recent news..." She left the sentence hanging. Ethan took the papers without reading them, his mind racing. The hospital wouldn't continue treatment without payment. His accounts were frozen. Victoria had made sure he couldn't access any emergency funds. The board had cut him off completely, and now the threat of arrest loomed over him like a dark cloud. He spent the night pacing the hospital corridors, his thoughts growing darker with each passing hour. By morning, a plan had formed, one born of desperation and fear. He would take Madison on a drive, just the two of them, like they used to do on Sunday afternoons. One last father-daughter outing before everything fell apart. As he helped Madison into his Mercedes the next morning, her face lit up with excitement despite her weakness. "Are we going on an adventure, Daddy?" Ethan's throat tightened as he buckled her seatbelt. "Yes, Princess, we're going on an adventure." He didn't tell her that he'd checked out of the hospital against medical advice, or that he'd turned off his phone to avoid the increasingly frantic calls from his lawyer, from James, from the hospital administrators. As they drove east out of Columbus, Madison dozed in the back seat, clutching the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was a baby. Ethan kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, trying to memorize every detail of her face. The way her dark curls fell across her forehead, the slight furrow of her brow as she slept, the delicate curve of her cheek that reminded him so much of her mother, his first wife, who died shortly after Madison was born. The sun was setting by the time they crossed into Pennsylvania, the countryside growing more remote with each passing mile. Madison had barely stirred, the medication making her sleep deeply. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, his mind racing with doubts and justifications. He told himself he was doing this for her, that she would have a better chance if someone else found her, someone who could afford her treatment, who wasn't about to go to prison, who could give her the life she deserved. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was running away. From his failures, from his responsibilities, from the consequences of his actions. The sky had turned a deep purple when he finally pulled onto a quiet country road, his headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Ahead, he could see the lights of a small town in the distance. It would be safe here, he told himself. Someone would find her quickly. But as he slowed the car, preparing to do the unthinkable, Madison stirred in the back seat. "Daddy?" she mumbled sleepily. "Where are we?" Ethan's heart nearly stopped at the sound of Madison's voice. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he pulled over to the side of the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The countryside stretched out around them, dark and unfamiliar in the growing twilight. "We're just taking a little break, Princess," he managed to say, his voice barely steady. "How are you feeling?" Madison shifted in her seat, the medication making her movements slow and uncoordinated. "I don't feel so good, Daddy. Can we go back to the hospital?" The innocence in her request felt like a physical blow. Ethan got out of the car, taking several deep breaths of the cool evening air. The sound of crickets filled the silence, a peaceful chorus that seemed to mock the turmoil in his heart. He opened the back door, kneeling beside Madison. "Here, let me help you get more comfortable," he said, adjusting her blanket and making sure her stuffed elephant was secure in her arms. Her skin felt warm, too warm. The fever was returning. "Daddy?" Madison's voice was small, confused. "Why are you crying?" Ethan hadn't even realized tears were running down his face. He quickly wiped them away. Just rest, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. He waited until her eyes drifted closed again, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of sleep. Then, with movements that felt mechanical, divorced from his consciousness, he placed an envelope on the seat beside her. Inside was all the cash he had left, barely enough for a few days' expenses, along with a note explaining Madison's medical condition and treatment schedule. The walk back to the driver's seat was the longest of his life. Each step felt like moving through quicksand, his body fighting against what his mind had decided was necessary. As he started the engine, he caught one last glimpse of Madison in the rearview mirror, peaceful in her medicated sleep, unaware that her world was about to shatter. Just do it quickly, he told himself, like ripping off a bandage. Don't think about it. Don't think about her waking up alone, scared, sick. Don't think about her calling for you in the darkness. Ethan put the car in drive and pressed the accelerator. The Mercedes moved forward slowly, leaving Madison behind in the growing shadows. He forced himself not to look back, even as his hands shook so badly he could barely steer. The image of her small form receding in his mirrors would haunt him for the rest of his life. Miles down the road, his composure finally broke. He pulled over and vomited on the side of the highway, his body rejecting the horror of what he'd just done. When there was nothing left in his stomach, he sat on the ground and sobbed, great heaving cries that echoed in the empty night. Back at the abandoned car, Madison slept on, unaware of the passage of time. The temperature dropped as night settled in fully, a light rain beginning to fall. It was well past midnight when headlights finally swept across the Mercedes, illuminating its expensive silhouette against the darkness. Margaret Wheeler had driven this road countless times in the 30 years she'd owned her small restaurant in town, but she'd never seen a car parked here so late at night. Something about it made her slow down, her instincts telling her something wasn't right. She pulled her old pickup truck alongside the Mercedes, shining her high beams through the windows. What she saw made her heart stop. A small child, alone in the back seat, clearly ill. Margaret was out of her truck in seconds, her arthritis forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. The car doors were unlocked, another detail that would later seem significant. When she opened the back door, the dome light revealed Madison's pale face, beaded with sweat. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Margaret whispered, reaching out to check the child's pulse. It was rapid but steady. The girl's skin burned with fever. Madison stirred at Margaret's touch, her eyes opening slowly. "Daddy," she called out weakly, looking around in confusion. "Shh, it's all right, honey," Margaret soothed, though her own heart was racing. "I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" "Madison," came the whispered reply. "Where's my daddy? He was just here." Margaret's eyes fell on the envelope on the seat. She picked it up with trembling fingers, reading the note inside. The clinical description of Madison's condition contrasted sharply with the desperate act it represented. Her eyes widened at the medical terminology: childhood leukemia, chemotherapy protocols, medication schedules. "My God," she breathed, looking at Madison with new understanding. The girl reminded her so much of Tommy, her own son, lost to illness 15 years ago. He'd been about Madison's age when the cancer took him, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. Margaret carefully gathered Madison into her arms, blanket and stuffed elephant included. "Let's get you somewhere warm, sweet girl. Everything's going to be okay now." Indeed, the drive to Margaret's house was tense, with Madison drifting in and out of consciousness in the passenger seat. Margaret spoke softly the whole way, trying to keep the girl calm while her own mind raced with questions and plans. Her small house above the restaurant wasn't much, but it was warm and clean. She carried Madison up the back stairs, her old muscles protesting but holding firm. The spare bedroom, Tommy's old room, was ready, as if it had been waiting all these years for another child who needed it. As she settled Madison into the bed, the girl's eyes opened again, more lucid this time. "Where am I?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "You're safe," Margaret assured her, smoothing back Madison's damp curls. "I'm Margaret, and you're going to stay with me for a while. Are you hungry? I make a pretty good chicken soup." Madison shook her head, tears beginning to fall. "I want my daddy. Why did he leave me?" Margaret's heart broke at the question she couldn't answer. She sat on the edge of the bed and gathered Madison into her arms, letting the girl cry against her shoulder. "I don't know, sweet child, I don't know, but I promise you're not alone anymore." As Madison's sobs quieted into exhausted sleep, Margaret sat in the old rocking chair by the window, watching over her new charge. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. This sick child needed expensive medical care, care that Margaret, with her modest restaurant income, could barely afford. But looking at Madison's sleeping face, Margaret knew she would find a way. She'd lost one child to illness, she wouldn't lose another. Tomorrow she would call the hospital in the next town over. She would talk to her bank about a second mortgage on the restaurant. She would do whatever it took. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the tire tracks of the Mercedes that had carried a desperate father away from his greatest mistake. Inside, in the warm light of a small bedroom, an unlikely family began to form from the broken pieces of two separate tragedies. The first weeks were the hardest. Margaret spent her days juggling the demands of her restaurant with Madison's constant medical needs. The local hospital had admitted Madison immediately after hearing her situation, but the bills were already mounting. Every morning, Margaret would wake before dawn to prep the restaurant's kitchen, then rush upstairs to check on Madison before the breakfast crowd arrived. Madison's condition had stabilized somewhat, but she remained weak and confused. The nights were the worst, when fever and fear would combine to wake her screaming for her father. Margaret would hold her through these episodes, rocking her gently and humming old lullabies until the tears subsided. "Why doesn't he want me anymore?" Madison would ask, her voice small and broken in the darkness. "Did I do something wrong?" Margaret's heart ached at these questions, for which she had no good answers. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, sweetheart," she would say, stroking Madison's back. "But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. You're perfect just as you are." One morning, about 3 weeks after Madison's arrival, Margaret was preparing the day's pies when she heard shuffling footsteps on the kitchen stairs. Madison stood in the doorway, pale but determined, still wearing the oversized t-shirt Margaret had given her as a nightgown. "Can I help?" Madison asked, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I used to help Rosa in the kitchen all the time." Margaret hesitated, worried about Madison's strength, but something in the girl's expression made her relent. "Well, these apples won't peel themselves," she said, pulling out a stool. "Just take it slow, okay?" Madison's face lit up as she carefully climbed onto the stool. Her hands trembled slightly as Margaret showed her how to hold the peeler, but her determination never wavered. Together, they worked through the pile of apples, Margaret sharing stories about the restaurant's history, while Madison concentrated on her task. "My mommy used to bake with me too," Madison said suddenly, not looking up from her apple. "Before she went to heaven, Daddy said I looked just like her." Margaret paused in her work, watching Madison process this memory. It was the first time she'd mentioned her mother. "Tell me about her," Margaret encouraged gently. As Madison spoke, her hands kept moving, muscle memory taking over as she described baking cookies and birthday cakes with her mother. The story was fragmented, pieced together from early childhood memories and things her father had told her, but it was the most Madison had spoken since arriving. "After Mommy died, Daddy got sad for a long time," Madison continued. "Then he married Victoria, but she didn't like to cook. She said it wasn't proper for people like us to spend time in the kitchen." Margaret noticed how Madison's shoulders tensed at the mention of her stepmother. "Well, I think the kitchen is the perfect place for people like us," she said, dropping a kiss on top of Madison's head. "Speaking of which, would you like to learn my special apple pie recipe? It's won the County Fair Blue Ribbon 3 years running. The days fell into a new rhythm after that. Madison would help in the kitchen when she felt strong enough, learning to measure ingredients and knead dough under Margaret's patient guidance. The regular customers at the restaurant began to look forward to seeing her peek around the kitchen door, her face lighting up at their compliments on the pies she'd helped prepare. But reality couldn't be kept at bay forever. One afternoon, Dr. Roberts, Madison's new oncologist, called Margaret into his office while a nurse stayed with Madison during her treatment. "Ms. Wheeler," he began, his expression grave, "I need to discuss Madison's situation with you. The current treatment protocol isn't showing the results we'd hoped for. There's a new therapy available that could be more effective, but—" He paused, shuffling through some papers on his desk. "But it's expensive," Margaret finished for him. She'd been expecting this conversation, dreading it, really. The doctor nodded. "Very. And while we've been able to work with you on the current treatments, this would be—" He named a figure that made Margaret's breath catch. That night, after Madison had fallen asleep, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by bills and bank statements. She'd already mortgaged the restaurant to its limit. Her savings were depleted. The small life insurance policy from her husband's death had been spent on the first round of Madison's treatments. As she stared at the numbers that refused to add up, Margaret heard soft coughing from Madison's room. She found the girl sitting up in bed, clutching her stuffed elephant. "Can't sleep?" Margaret asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Madison shook her head. "I had a bad dream about the night Daddy left." She looked up at Margaret, her eyes wide in the dim light. "You won't leave me too, will you?" Margaret pulled Madison into her arms, holding her close. "Never, sweetheart. We're family now, and family sticks together." After Madison had drifted back to sleep, Margaret remained in the rocking chair, watching the moonlight play across the girl's peaceful face. An idea began to form in her mind, crazy perhaps, but born of love and determination. The next morning she called a realtor about selling her house. She could move into the small apartment above the restaurant permanently, she reasoned. The house had been in her family for generations, but what good was holding on to the past if it meant losing the future? When she explained her plan to Dr. Roberts, he seemed skeptical. "Ms. Wheeler, are you sure about this? Even with the sale of your house, the treatment costs could still exceed—" "I'll find a way," Margaret interrupted firmly. "I've already lost one child to cancer. I won't lose another." That evening, as Margaret taught Madison how to crimp the edges of a pie crust, she watched the girl's face scrunch in concentration, her tongue poking out slightly as she focused on getting the pattern just right. Despite everything she'd been through, Madison still found joy in these small moments, still approached each day with hope and determination. "You know what?" Madison said, looking up from her work with flour dusting her cheeks. "I think this is the best pie I've ever made." Margaret smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Madison's forehead. "It certainly is, sweetheart. And you know what makes it special?" "What?" "It's made with love. That's the secret ingredient that makes everything better." As they worked side by side in the warm kitchen, the smell of baking apples and cinnamon filling the air, Margaret silently renewed her promise to Madison. She would move heaven and earth to save this child, no matter the cost. Because sometimes, she realized, the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. But even as she made these plans, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their challenges were far from over. The question of Madison's father still hung over them like a shadow, and the road ahead would test them in ways neither could imagine. 5 years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the steady rhythm of life in Margaret's small restaurant. Madison's recovery was neither quick nor easy, but with each passing month, her strength grew. The experimental treatment, paid for by the sale of Margaret's house, and countless fundraising dinners hosted by the restaurant's loyal customers, had slowly begun to show results. Now 13, Madison had grown into a thoughtful young girl who spent every free moment in the restaurant's kitchen. Her hands, once weakened by illness, had grown confident and sure as she worked alongside Margaret, learning the intricacies of their shared craft. The bald head that had once marked her as a cancer patient was now covered with thick, dark curls that she often tied back with the same careful precision she used when measuring ingredients. "The secret to perfect bread," Margaret explained one morning as they prepared for the breakfast rush, "is patience. You can't rush the dough. It needs time to develop, to become what it's meant to be." Madison nodded, her hands working the dough with practiced ease. Over the years, she'd come to understand that Margaret's cooking lessons were often about more than just food. The kitchen had become her classroom, her therapy room, her sanctuary. The bell above the restaurant door chimed, and Sarah, their regular waitress, stuck her head into the kitchen. "The food critic from the Lancaster newspaper is here," she whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. Margaret and Madison exchanged glances. The restaurant had been doing well, but a good review in a major paper could bring in the extra customers they desperately needed. The medical bills, though reduced, still arrived with crushing regularity. "He ordered the special," Sarah added, "and he's asking about the pies." Then we'll give him something to write about," Madison said with determination, already reaching for the ingredients to start a fresh batch of her signature apple pie, the recipe she'd perfected during long hours of practice between treatments. As they worked, Margaret watched Madison move around the kitchen with grace and confidence. Gone was the frightened, sick child she'd found in that car 5 years ago. In her place stood a young woman who had faced her fears and found her strength in the steady heat of the kitchen. The afternoon brought another regular visitor, Dr. Roberts, who had become more than just Madison's oncologist over the years. He took his usual seat at the counter, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah while he waited for Madison to emerge from the kitchen. "Blood work came back perfect," he announced when Madison appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "One more year of clean results, and we can officially use the R word, remission, the word they'd been afraid to hope for during those first difficult years." Madison's smile lit up the entire restaurant, and several regular customers who had followed her journey burst into spontaneous applause. But even in this moment of joy, Margaret noticed the shadow that crossed Madison's face, the same shadow that appeared whenever something reminded her of her father. They never spoke of him, but Margaret knew the wound of his abandonment had never fully healed. Later that evening, after the restaurant had closed and the kitchen was clean, Margaret found Madison sitting on the back steps, staring at the stars. These quiet moments had become their special time when the day's work was done and they could just be together. "I got another letter from the hospital in Columbus," Madison said quietly, not looking at Margaret. "They're still trying to find him. They say they need his medical history for their records." Margaret sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. They'd been through this before. The hospitals, the social workers, all trying to locate Ethan Morgan. He had vanished completely after that night, leaving no trace beyond the memories that still haunted his daughter. "You know," Madison continued, her voice thoughtful, "I used to dream about him coming back. I used to imagine he had a good reason for leaving me, that he was trying to protect me from something. But now..." She trailed off, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Now what, sweetheart? Now I think maybe it was better this way. Because if he hadn't left me, I wouldn't have found you. I wouldn't have found this." She gestured toward the kitchen behind them. "I wouldn't have found who I'm supposed to be." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "And who is that?" Madison smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that seemed beyond her years. "I'm your daughter. I'm a fighter. And I'm going to be a chef who makes food that reminds people there's still good in the world, even when everything seems dark." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets and watching the stars emerge. Madison's head rested on Margaret's shoulder, her breathing deep and steady. So different from those early nights filled with fever and fear. "The food critic's review comes out tomorrow," Madison said finally. "Do you think he liked the pie?" "He cleaned his plate and asked for seconds," Margaret chuckled. "I'd say that's a good sign." "I was thinking," Madison sat up straighter, her eyes bright with excitement, "what if we expanded the menu? I've been experimenting with some of your old recipes, adding new twists. Maybe we could start a Sunday brunch service." Margaret listened as Madison outlined her ideas, her heart swelling with pride. This was the girl who had once been too weak to hold a spoon, now planning menus and dreaming of innovations for their little restaurant. The next morning, the newspaper arrived with their review prominently featured in the food section. The critic had been effusive in his praise, particularly about Madison's apple pie, which he described as a perfect blend of tradition and innovation, quite possibly the best in Pennsylvania. As Madison read the review aloud to the morning staff, her voice trembling with excitement, Margaret noticed Sarah wiping tears from her eyes. They had all been part of Madison's journey, all contributed to the tip jar marked Madison's Medical Fund that still sat on the counter. But their celebration was interrupted by the arrival of a certified letter. Margaret recognized the return address. It was from the hospital's billing department. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, stepping away from the others to read its contents in private. The numbers stared up at her from the page, cold and demanding. Despite all their efforts, despite the sale of her house and the community fundraisers and the payment plans, they were still falling behind. The new treatment had saved Madison's life, but the cost had been astronomical. Margaret folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. This was her burden to bear, not Madison's. Not today, when her girl was finally seeing her dreams begin to take shape. She watched as Madison hugged Sarah, both of them laughing as they read the review again. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the highlights in Madison's hair and the joy in her smile. In that moment, Margaret knew she would find a way to handle the bills. She had to, because sometimes the most precious things in life came with the highest price tags. But they were always worth it. The years continued to flow like honey from a jar, sweet but measured, each one bringing new changes to Margaret's restaurant. Madison, now 23, had transformed their modest establishment into one of the most talked-about dining destinations in Pennsylvania. The Sunday brunch she'd proposed as a teenager had become so popular that reservations were required weeks in advance, and food critics from Philadelphia and New York regularly made the journey to experience her innovative take on traditional American comfort food. The kitchen, though modernized with new equipment, still held the warmth and character that had first captured Madison's heart as a child. On this particular morning, she stood at her favorite workstation, preparing for a special event that could change everything. The Food Network had sent a production team to film a segment about up-and-coming chefs in rural America, and Madison's story, or at least the parts of it she chose to share, had caught their attention. "Remember to breathe," Margaret advised, watching Madison meticulously plate her signature dish, a deconstructed apple pie that paid homage to their first cooking lesson together while incorporating techniques Madison had learned during her culinary school training. "You've done this 1,000 times, Madison smiled, though her hands trembled slightly as she placed the final garnish. "It's different this time," she said softly. "This isn't just about the food. This is about showing people that something beautiful can come from—" She paused, swallowing hard. "From difficult beginnings." The production crew arrived right on schedule, filling their cozy kitchen with lights, cameras, and microphones. The young producer, Emma, had spent the previous day interviewing regular customers and staff, gathering background for the segment. Now it was Madison's turn to tell her story. "So, Madison," Emma began once the cameras were rolling, "tell us about your journey to becoming a chef. What inspired you to pursue this path?" Madison's hands moved steadily as she demonstrated her techniques, her voice clear and confident. "Cooking saved my life in more ways than one. When I was 8, I was very sick with leukemia. Margaret took me in when I had nowhere else to go, and this kitchen became my sanctuary. Every recipe I learned was another step toward healing, both physically and emotionally. And Margaret became your legal guardian? Emma prompted gently. Madison nodded, sharing a warm look with Margaret. She became much more than that. She became my mother in every way that matters. She taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who stays by your side through the hardest times. The interview continued smoothly until Emma asked the question they'd been dreading. Your biological parents, have they seen your success? Do they know what you've accomplished? The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerators. Madison's hands stilled on the cutting board, her knife hovering over a perfectly sliced apple. Margaret stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Madison squared her shoulders and answered with quiet dignity. My mother passed away when I was very young. As for my father, she took a deep breath. Sometimes people make choices that can't be unmade. What matters is what we choose to do with the life we're given. The producer seemed to sense the weight behind those words and wisely moved on to other topics. But later that evening, after the crew had packed up their equipment and left, Madison sat at the kitchen counter, unusually quiet. You handled that beautifully, Margaret said, placing a cup of tea in front of her. Did I? Madison asked, staring into the steaming cup. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being a coward by not telling the whole truth. About him, about that night. Margaret pulled up a stool beside her. You're protecting yourself, and there's nothing cowardly about that. Besides, you told the most important truth, about how love and determination can change lives. Madison reached for Margaret's hand, squeezing it tightly. I've been thinking, maybe it's time to expand again. Not just the restaurant, but something bigger. A cooking school for kids dealing with illness or trauma. A place where they can find what I found here. Before Margaret could respond, Sarah burst into the kitchen, waving her phone excitedly. You have to see this. Someone posted a video of Madison from the filming today, and it's going viral. The comments are incredible. Indeed, the short clip of Madison describing how cooking helped her through her illness had struck a chord with viewers. Comments poured in from around the country, sharing similar stories of healing through food and asking when they could visit the restaurant. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The segment aired on the Food Network, bringing even more attention. Food magazines requested interviews, and several publishers expressed interest in a cookbook. Madison handled it all with grace, but Margaret noticed she seemed increasingly preoccupied. One night, after a particularly busy service, Madison was clearing up the kitchen when she found an old newspaper that had slipped behind one of the freezers. The headline caught her eye. Ohio business mogul vanishes amid fraud investigation. The paper was yellowed with age, but the photo was clear enough. Ethan Morgan, her father, looking much younger and more confident than she remembered. I found this, she said quietly when Margaret came to check on her. It's from right after that night. They never found him, did they? Margaret shook her head. The police searched, but it was like he disappeared into thin air. The fraud charges were never filed because they couldn't locate him. Madison traced her father's face in the photograph. I used to imagine scenarios, that he had amnesia or was forced to leave to protect me from something. But the truth is probably much simpler. He just couldn't handle it, any of it. Madison, Margaret began carefully, you don't owe him anything. Not your thoughts, not your worry, and certainly not your success. I know, Madison said, folding the newspaper carefully, but sometimes I wonder if he ever thinks about me, if he knows what happened after he drove away that night, if he regrets it. The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Outside, they could hear the last of the evening traffic passing by, the normal sounds of their small town winding down for the night. The kitchen, usually Madison's comfort zone, felt suddenly too small, too full of memories. I've been offered a spot on a cooking show, Madison said suddenly. "Not just as a guest. They want me to host my own segment. It would mean being on national television, telling my story to millions of people." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She knew what Madison wasn't saying, that such exposure would make it impossible to keep the past hidden. If she became a public figure, the truth about that night would eventually come out. "Whatever you decide," Margaret said carefully, "I'm with you. We'll face it together, just like we always have." Madison stood up straighter, her decision visible in the set of her shoulders. "Then I think it's time. Time to stop hiding. Time to show others that your past doesn't define your future. That's what you taught me after all." As they locked up the restaurant that night, neither of them could have known that across the country, in a small apartment in Detroit, a broken man was about to see a familiar face on his television screen. A face that would force him to confront the worst mistake of his life. Ethan Morgan's life had become a study in shadows. His apartment in Detroit was small and sparse, the furniture second-hand, the walls bare except for water stains that spread like age spots across the ceiling. At 60, he looked far older than his years, his once commanding presence diminished by time and regret. The designer suits and gold watches had been replaced by worn khakis and a $10 timepiece from a discount store. He worked as a night janitor at a local high school, the kind of job where people didn't ask too many questions about your past. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once owned a chain of premium supermarkets now spent his evenings mopping floors and emptying trash cans. But it was honest work, and after everything he'd done, honest work felt like a kind of penance. That evening, he sat in his threadbare recliner, eating a microwave dinner and half watching the Food Network, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. The TV had been a gift from Mrs. Chen next door, who worried about him living alone with no entertainment. The cooking shows reminded him of Rosa, his old housekeeper, and the warm meals she used to prepare. Before everything fell apart, before that night. The show's regular programming was interrupted by a promotional segment for an upcoming series. "Next week on Rising Stars of American Cuisine," the announcer's voice boomed, "we feature the incredible story of Madison Wheeler, the young chef who transformed a small Pennsylvania restaurant into a culinary destination." Ethan's fork clattered to the floor. On the screen was a face he saw every night in his dreams. Older now, more mature, but unmistakably his daughter. Madison stood in a professional kitchen, her dark curls pulled back, her smile confident as she demonstrated a cooking technique. She looked so much like her mother, it made his chest ache. "After battling childhood leukemia," the announcer continued, "Madison found healing through cooking, mentored by Margaret Wheeler, the restaurant owner who became her adoptive mother." The remote control shook in Ethan's hand as he turned up the volume. Madison was alive. More than alive, she was thriving. The glimpses shown in the promotional footage revealed a poised, successful young woman, nothing like the sick child he'd left on that dark road 15 years ago. He stumbled to his bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before vomiting. When there was nothing left in his stomach, he sat on the cold, tiled floor, his head in his hands, memories washing over him like acid. The next morning, instead of going to sleep after his shift as usual, Ethan went to the public library. With trembling fingers, he typed Madison's name into the computer. Article after article appeared, reviews of her restaurant, interviews about her innovative approach to traditional American cuisine, features about her work with sick children. One interview in particular caught his eye. Madison described teaching cooking classes to young cancer patients, showing them how to make simple, nutritious meals that could appeal to their treatment-weakened appetites. The article included a photo of her kneeling beside a bald child who was proudly displaying a plate of cookies. "I know what it's like," Madison was quoted as saying. "When you're sick, everything feels out of your control. But in the kitchen, you can create something beautiful, something that brings joy to others. That's powerful medicine." Ethan printed every article he could find, spending nearly $20 of his carefully budgeted money on printer fees. Back in his apartment, he spread the papers across his small kitchen table, creating a timeline of the years he'd missed. The success of the restaurant, culinary school graduation, awards, and recognition. Each achievement was a knife in his heart, a reminder of how completely he had failed her. And through it all, there was Margaret Wheeler, the woman who had done what he couldn't, who had saved his daughter's life while he ran away like a coward. That night at work, as he cleaned the high school's hallways, Ethan found himself pausing by the display cases filled with student achievements. How many of Madison's accomplishments had been displayed somewhere? How many proud parent moments had he missed? He was mopping the cafeteria floor when one of the night shift security guards, Bob, stopped by for his usual chat. "You don't look so good, Ed," he said, using the fake name Ethan had given when he was hired. "Everything okay?" Ethan managed a weak smile. "Just thinking about my daughter." "Didn't know you had one," Bob said, surprised. In 3 years of working together, Ethan had never mentioned family. "I lost her a long time ago." The words felt like glass in his throat. Bob nodded sympathetically, assuming the worst. "I'm sorry, man. Losing a child, that's the hardest thing there is." But Ethan hadn't lost her. He had thrown her away, and now she was everywhere, her success a glaring spotlight on his greatest shame. He called in sick the next day, something he'd never done before, and spent hours watching videos of Madison's cooking demonstrations online. She moved through the kitchen with confidence and grace, her hands sure and steady as she worked. Sometimes she would laugh at something off camera, and the sound would transport him back to Sunday mornings at home, when she would giggle at his clumsy attempts to make pancakes. One video showed her teaching a group of elderly women how to make pie crust. "My mom always says patience is the key," Madison explained, demonstrating the proper technique. "You can't rush good food, just like you can't rush healing." The casual way she referred to Margaret as Mom felt like a physical blow. But wasn't this what he had wanted? For someone to take care of her, to love her, to give her the life he couldn't? As evening approached, Ethan found himself reaching for the bottle of whiskey he kept hidden in the back of his cabinet. Another luxury he rarely allowed himself. But before he could open it, there was a knock at his door. It was Mrs. Chen, holding a plate of dumplings. "You didn't come out today," she said, pushing past him into the apartment. "Not good to stay inside too much. Makes the mind go dark places." She stopped when she saw the articles spread across his table, her eyes narrowing at the photos of Madison. "Who is this girl? She looks like you, around the eyes." Ethan sat heavily in his chair. "My daughter," he whispered. Mrs. Chen studied the articles, her expression softening. "Ah, such a successful girl. You must be very proud." "I haven't seen her in 15 years, Ethan said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I left her, abandoned her when she was sick. I was a coward." Instead of the disgust he expected, Mrs. Chen's face showed only sadness. She sat down across from him, pushing the plate of dumplings forward. "Eat first," she said firmly, "then you tell me everything." And somehow, in his tiny kitchen with its flickering fluorescent light, Ethan found himself telling the whole story to this tiny Chinese woman who made it her business to feed all the lonely people in their building. He told her about his empire of supermarkets, about Victoria's betrayal, about Madison's illness, and finally, about that dark night on a Pennsylvania road. When he finished, Mrs. Chen was silent for a long moment. Then she stood up and smacked him hard on the back of the head. "Stupid man," she said, but her voice was gentle. "Running away never fixes anything, only makes the heart grow heavier." She pointed to Madison's picture in one of the articles. "But look, she is strong, beautiful, successful, maybe universe giving you second chance. Question is, are you brave enough to take it?" Ethan stared at the photo of Madison in her kitchen, surrounded by the life she had built without him. Could he dare to hope for forgiveness? Did he even deserve it? That night, for the first time in 15 years, Ethan Morgan began to write a letter to his daughter. Whether he would ever find the courage to send it was another question entirely. Madison's television appearance changed everything. The morning after the show aired, the restaurant's phone rang constantly with reservation requests and media inquiries. But among the stack of messages Sarah collected, one stood out. A plain white envelope with no return address, simply marked Madison Wheeler in shaky handwriting. Madison was in the kitchen preparing for the breakfast rush when Margaret brought her the letter. Something in Margaret's expression made Madison pause in her work, wiping her hands slowly on her apron. "This came in the morning mail," Margaret said softly, holding out the envelope as if it might burst into flames. "I recognize the handwriting, Madison. It's your father's." The kitchen suddenly felt too warm, too small. Madison took the envelope with trembling fingers but didn't open it. Instead, she placed it in her pocket and returned to her work, measuring ingredients with mechanical precision. "You don't have to read it," Margaret said, watching her daughter's rigid movements. "No one would blame you if you threw it away." Madison continued working, her face expressionless. "The morning rush will be starting soon. We need to focus on that first." But her usual grace in the kitchen was gone, replaced by movements that were almost robotic. Throughout the morning service, the letter seemed to burn in Madison's pocket. She could feel its weight as she moved through her familiar routines, its presence a constant reminder of the past she'd worked so hard to overcome. It wasn't until late afternoon, during the quiet period between lunch and dinner, that Madison finally found the courage to open it. She sat at her favorite spot on the back steps of the restaurant, the same place where she'd spent countless hours talking with Margaret over the years. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. "My dearest Madison," the letter began, the words slightly smudged, as if tears had fallen on them. "I saw you on television last night. You look so much like your mother that for a moment I couldn't breathe. I've spent 15 years trying to convince myself that what I did was for your own good, that someone else could give you a better life than a failed, cowardly father. But watching you talk about your journey, seeing the amazing woman you've become, I realize that I've been lying to myself all this time. I didn't leave you for your sake. I left because I was weak, because I couldn't face my own failures." Madison had to stop reading for a moment, her vision blurred by tears. Margaret, who had been watching from the doorway, quietly sat down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her back. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter continued. "I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that not a day has passed when I haven't thought about you, haven't wondered if you were safe, if you were happy. Seeing you on that show, hearing you talk about finding healing through cooking, about the mother who took you in and loved you when I couldn't, it broke something in me that I didn't even know was still whole." The letter went on to describe his life now, the night janitor job, the small apartment in Detroit, the years of running from his shame. He explained about Victoria's betrayal, the financial collapse, the impending arrest that had driven him to make the worst decision of his life. "None of these are excuses," he wrote. "There can be no excuse for what I did. I'm writing this letter not to ask for forgiveness, but to tell you how incredibly proud I am of the woman you've become, despite having a father who failed you so completely. You have your mother's strength, her grace under pressure, her ability to create beauty from pain. The work you're doing with sick children, teaching them to find joy in cooking, it's everything she would have wanted for you." The final paragraph was barely legible, the handwriting increasingly unsteady. "I'm sick now, Madison. The doctors say it's cancer. Ironic, isn't it? All those years ago, I left you alone to face this battle, and now I'm facing it myself. Perhaps it's justice. I don't know if you'll ever read this letter, or if you'll even believe it's really from me. But I needed you to know that the guilt of what I did has been my constant companion, my punishment, my penance." He included his address and phone number, but added, "I understand if you never want to contact me. You owe me nothing. I just wanted you to know that your real father, not the man I was pretending to be back then, but your real father, loves you and has never stopped loving you, even though I lost the right to call myself your father the moment I drove away that night." The letter was signed simply, Ethan Morgan. Madison sat in silence for a long time after finishing the letter, her emotions too tangled to process. Margaret waited patiently beside her, offering the quiet support that had helped Madison through so many difficult moments. "He's dying," Madison finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's dying, and he's alone, just like I was sick and alone that night." She looked at Margaret, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. "What am I supposed to do with this?" "Whatever feels right to you," Margaret answered carefully. "You don't owe him anything, Madison. Not your time, not your forgiveness, not even a response." Madison stood up, pacing the small back area of the restaurant. "But that's just it. I know I don't owe him anything. You're my mother in every way that matters. You're the one who held me through the fevers and the treatments, who taught me to cook, who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." She paused, looking at the letter in her hands. "But I can't just ignore this. I need to see him, to understand." Margaret's heart clenched with fear that this man who had hurt Madison so deeply might somehow hurt her again. But she also knew that her daughter needed this closure, needed to face the ghost that had haunted her for 15 years. "Then we'll go together," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." Madison shook her head. "No, I need to do this alone. But I promise, I'll call you if I need you." That evening, after the restaurant closed, Madison sat at the kitchen counter planning her trip to Detroit. She would drive up the next day, taking only a short break from the restaurant for the first time in years. As she made her arrangements, she found herself automatically reaching for ingredients, her hands needing the familiar comfort of cooking. By midnight, she had baked 6 apple pies, the same recipe she'd learned on her first day in Margaret's kitchen. The familiar motions of peeling apples, mixing dough, and carefully crimping edges helped calm her racing thoughts. "I'll bring him one," she decided, packaging the best pie carefully. "Not because he deserves it, but because I need him to understand who I am now, who I became, despite what he did." As she prepared for bed that night, Madison caught her reflection in the mirror. She saw traces of her father in her features, the shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw. But she also saw the strength that Margaret had helped her discover, the confidence that came from being loved unconditionally. Tomorrow, she would face her past. But tonight, in the apartment above the restaurant that had become her sanctuary, she was simply Margaret Wheeler's daughter, a chef who had learned that the best recipes for healing often came from the most unexpected ingredients. The apartment building in Detroit was exactly as Ethan had described it in his letter. A tired 5-story walk-up with peeling paint and a broken elevator. Madison stood outside for several minutes, the carefully packaged pie held against her chest like a shield. Through the grimy windows, she could see old Mrs. Chen, who had called her the day before to make sure she was really coming. When Madison finally climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, she found Mrs. Chen waiting in the hallway. The elderly woman took one look at Madison's face and pulled her into a tight embrace. "You look just like his old pictures, Mrs." Chen said, stepping back to study her. "He's having a bad day today. The treatments make him very weak, but he's waiting for you." Madison nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand and pointed to apartment 4C before discreetly disappearing into her own unit, leaving Madison alone in the dimly lit hallway. The door opened before she could knock. Ethan Morgan stood before her, a ghost of the man she remembered. He was thin, almost gaunt, his once commanding presence diminished by illness and age, but his eyes, her eyes, were the same. "Madison," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. His hands twitched at his sides as if he wanted to reach for her but didn't dare. "I brought pie," she said, the words coming out automatically. "Apple. It's what I learned to make first in Margaret's kitchen. Ethan stepped back, allowing her to enter the small apartment. The space was clean but sparse, with second-hand furniture and bare walls. The only decoration was a cluster of newspaper clippings about Madison on the kitchen wall, reviews of her restaurant, articles about her success. "I've been following your career," he said softly, gesturing to the clippings. "Every article I could find, every TV appearance, His voice broke. "I'm so proud of you, Madison, so incredibly proud." "You don't have the right to be proud of me," Madison replied, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside her. "You didn't help me become who I am. Margaret did that. She's the one who held me through the nightmares, who believed in me, who sacrificed everything to pay for my treatments." Ethan sank into a worn armchair, his shoulders slumping. "I know, you're absolutely right. I have no right to anything in your life. But seeing you now, knowing that you survived, that you thrived," he wiped at his eyes with trembling hands, "it's more than I deserve." Madison set the pie on the small kitchen counter and looked around the apartment. There were pill bottles everywhere, a calendar marked with treatment appointments, a wheelchair folded in the corner. The evidence of his illness was impossible to ignore. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally, the question that had haunted her for 15 years. "The truth this time, not the excuses in your letter. I need to know why a father would leave his sick child alone on a dark road." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Because I was a coward," he said finally. "Because I'd lost everything, my business, my wealth, my reputation, and I couldn't bear to lose you too. I convinced myself you'd be better off if someone else found you, someone who could afford your treatments, who wasn't about to go to prison. But the truth is, I ran away because I was weak, because facing my failures as a businessman was one thing, but facing my failures as your father—" He shook his head, tears falling freely now. "I couldn't do it. And in trying to escape that pain, I inflicted something far worse on you." Madison moved to the window, looking out at the city below. The same city where her father had hidden for 15 years while she built a new life without him. "I used to imagine all these scenarios," she said quietly, "that you were secretly protecting me from something, that you had amnesia, that you'd been forced to leave. I made up so many stories because the truth was too painful, that my father simply didn't love me enough to stay." "Madison, no." Ethan tried to stand but stumbled, his weakness evident. "I loved you more than anything, I still do. What I did, it wasn't about not loving you enough. It was about not being strong enough to be the father you deserved. But Margaret was strong enough." Madison turned to face him. "She was a stranger who found a sick child in an abandoned car, and she was strong enough to take me in, to fight for me, to love me. She remortgaged her house, sold family heirlooms, worked 18-hour days to pay for my treatments. That's what real love looks like." "She sounds like an amazing woman," Ethan said softly. "I thank God every day that she found you." Madison moved to the kitchen counter and began cutting the pie, the familiar motions helping to calm her racing heart. "When I was sick, she taught me to bake. She said focusing on creating something beautiful would help me forget the pain for a while. And it did. Every recipe I learned was another step toward healing. Not just my body, but my heart." She placed a slice of pie in front of Ethan. "This is the first recipe she taught me. I've made it thousands of times since then, but I remember every detail of that first lesson. I was so weak I could barely hold the rolling pin, but she never gave up on me. She said everyone deserves a chance to create something good in the world." Ethan took a small bite, closing his eyes as the flavors hit his tongue. "It's perfect," he whispered, "just like your mother used to make." "Margaret is my mother," Madison corrected him gently. "My first mother gave me life, and I honor her memory. But Margaret, she taught me how to live." They sat in silence for a while, the pie between them like a bridge across 15 years of absence. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice weak but determined. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Madison. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that not a day has passed when I haven't regretted what I did. And seeing the amazing woman you've become, it's more than I could have ever hoped for." Madison studied his face, seeing the toll that cancer and chemotherapy had taken. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said quietly. "Not for your sake, but for mine. I couldn't carry that anger anymore. It was poisoning everything good in my life." Tears rolled down Ethan's hollow cheeks. "You truly are your mother's daughter. Both of them. You have Claire's grace and Margaret's strength." "I'm my own person," Madison corrected him. "Made from all the pieces of my past, but not defined by them." She stood, gathering her purse. "I need to get back to the restaurant, but I'd like to come visit again if that's okay. Not because you deserve it, but because I choose to." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. As Madison reached the door, he finally found his voice. "The pie," he said. "Thank you for sharing it with me." "There's more in the kitchen," she replied. "And the recipe, it's all about patience, about letting things take the time they need." She paused, her hand on the doorknob, "just like healing." As Madison walked back to her car, she called Margaret. "I'm okay," she said before Margaret could ask. "It was hard, but necessary. I think I needed to see him, to understand." "Are you coming home now?" Margaret asked, concern evident in her voice. Madison smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes, Mom. I'm coming home." 3 months later, Madison stood in her kitchen, teaching another cooking class for young cancer patients. As she helped a small girl measure ingredients, she thought about her father, now in hospice care. She visited him weekly, sharing meals and cautiously building a new kind of relationship. Not the one they'd lost, but something different, something tempered by time and understanding. Margaret often asked if these visits were too painful, but Madison knew they were part of her healing journey. Just as she taught her students that cooking was about transformation, turning simple ingredients into something special, she was learning that forgiveness could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. That evening, as she and Margaret closed up the restaurant, Madison looked around the kitchen that had saved her life in so many ways. "I've been thinking," she said, "about expanding our cooking program for sick kids. Maybe opening a full-time teaching kitchen, specifically for children dealing with illness or trauma." Margaret smiled, remembering the scared little girl who had once been too weak to hold a spoon. "I think that's a wonderful idea. After all, everyone deserves a chance to create something good in the world." Madison hugged her mother tightly, grateful for the millionth time for that night, 15 years ago, when fate had led Margaret to find her. Sometimes she realized the worst moments in life could lead to the most beautiful transformations, just like turning simple apples and flour into something that could warm the heart and heal the soul. "Come on," Margaret said, hanging up her apron. "Let's go home. Tomorrow's another day of making something good." And in that moment, standing in the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, Madison knew that she had finally found the perfect recipe. Not just for apple pie, but for life itself.